Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to begin by hearing further evidence from Ms. Diane Marshall of the National House Building Council. Would you ask Ms. Marshall to come back in, please? Thank you. Good morning, Ms. Marshall.
Good morning.
All ready to go?
Yes, thank you.
Good, thank you. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, good morning. Good morning, members of the panel. Ms. Marshall, good morning to you. We were in the middle last night when we stopped of the email of the 11th of July 2014 from Steve Evans to Brian Martin. Can we please go back to that? It is at NHB 50732, please. And if we can go to page 2 in the email run, you can see in the second paragraph down on your screen, it says this: as we had a number of projects under construction and in advanced stages of design utilising K15, NHBC approached Kingspan and made them aware of our concerns. As a result of this dialogue, Kingspan are currently undertaking further testing using different cladding and facade treatments in accordance with BS 84 Part 1, 2002. The results from the tests are expected by the end of this month, and NHBC are meeting with Kingspan at the beginning of August, at which time Kingspan will be asked to provide evidence that their product can be used in alternative construction types other than that specified in the current BBA certificate. Now, again, pausing there, as it says, there were projects with K15 in advanced stages of design and construction at the time. Was building control approval by your approved inspectors or by the inspectors in BCS Limited suspended while that issue was being dealt with?
In relation to projects from the 1st of January, we were accepting registrations of projects. And that involves the builder submitting an application to us to outline what products they want to purchase from NHBC, i.e. warranty or building control. So those projects would have been registered. And when they're set up on our systems, there is a standard blocking condition that is applied to all projects that says that we will need an awful lot of construction details to satisfy ourselves that these standards and regulations are being complied with. So there is always that condition in place from day one. Through the course of the project, these projects are quite sizable and take some time to develop the details. They also are submitted in staged or phases of the construction elements. So the initial focus will be around the foundation design, the frame design, etc., the ground conditions. All of those elements would be looked at first. And the sort of cladding package or details of the wall constructions would tend to come later in the design process. So unlike a local authority, we don't have a 5 or 8 week window to complete our assessment. It's an ongoing assessment managed through the process of conditions. So whilst those projects were accepted for registration, they were not accepted for building control compliance. That is an ongoing project or process through the life of the project until we get all of the information that satisfies the requirements.
Right, that's got a long evidence-rich answer, which doesn't quite meet my question. Let me put it more simply. During the period between the 1st of January 2014 and the date of this email, 11th of July 2014, were building control officers within your subsidiary granting approval, in other words, signing off certificates that tall buildings containing K15 complied, or were they not?
They would only have been signing off acceptances on the basis of the pre-2014 BBA certificate, because there wasn't any projects that were coming up to completion post that date.
That I understand, but I think the answer, and tell me if this is wrong, is no. Your building control officers were granting building regulation compliance certification on tall buildings using a K15 above 18 metres during that 7-month period.
Based on the 2013 BBA certificate, yes.
Even though by now you knew that it had been changed and was wrong.
Well, firstly, we didn't know it was wrong. Secondly, the BBA certificate is valid on the date of the application being submitted to a building control body. So applications submitted prior to the 31st of December 2013 would have been assessed on the basis of a valid current BBA certificate at the time the application was made.
As Head of Technical Services, the responsibility for allowing your building control officers to continue in July 2014 to approve the use of K15 in external wall build-ups in buildings over 18 metres was yours, I think, wasn't it?
Yes.
Ultimately.
Yes.
Can you account for how come NHBC, despite knowing or having excellent reasons to think that K15 did not comply in all build-ups above 18 metres with approved document B, was content to let its building control officers continue to approve its use on such buildings within that 7-month period?
As I stated, within that 7-month period, there wouldn't have been any projects that would have been completed post the 1st of January 14.
So it comes back to the BBA certificate as it stood up to midnight on the 31st of December 2013.
Yes.
I see. And as at mid-July 2014, is it your position that even though you knew or had very good reason to think that when it referred to 12.7 it was clearly a mistake, nonetheless, because it was a BBA certificate, that permitted you to permit your BCAs to sign off such buildings?
Yes, based on the 2013 certificate.
Right.
And when you were signing off buildings, you were formally confirming not that the structure complied with ADB, but that the structure complied with the building regulation functional requirement. Is that right?
Yes, the completion certificate is evidence but not conclusive evidence of compliance. That's the way it's worded in the legislation.
But in your mind, your building surveyor's mind, should be addressed to functional requirement.
Yes.
And therefore, if compliance with ADB was apparent on paper but known or suspected not to be correct in substance, could he justify signing off compliance with the functional requirement?
At that stage, the BBA certificate for 2013 was valid in relation to projects that would have been registered
But
at that point in time.
I think you're missing my point. Let's assume that it was valid, whatever that is supposed to mean. It said what it said. But if it were the case that what it said was obviously either wrong or suspect, would that provide a sufficient basis for signing off on the functional requirement, B4?
It would have been assessed against the available information at the time relevant to the submission date of the application.
And I'm not sure you're answering my question. Can you understand what I'm asking?
Yes. We would have taken available evidence that related to when the application was submitted, and as there was a valid BBA certificate in place at the time until the end of December, that would have applied to that project through the course of its life.
Even if and it would justify accepting compliance with functional requirement B41, even if it were the case that the certificate was either obviously wrong or very likely to be wrong.
At that stage, there was no evidence that the certificate was...
No, I'm asking you a hypothetical question.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm not interested in any particular certificate. I'm just asking you that question. You've got an incorrect or potentially incorrect certificate of apparent compliance with ADB, but suggesting that the building doesn't comply with B4. What do you do?
We would take all available evidence and review that in relation to the specific project. And make a decision on that basis relative to the functional requirements. As I think I mentioned yesterday, that the concept of a BBA certificate is well established within the industry, and within the statutory guidance that supports the functional requirements. So there was a process that was followed by my surveyors that allowed that to be completed.
All right. Thank you very much.
Did all available evidence not include the warning that had come from Wintec at the meeting and John Lewis's own views about what he had learnt in the last quarter or last 4 months of 2013?
It was part of it, yes, and it informed our discussions with Kingspan to gather further evidence.
Did all available evidence not include the fact, as communicated to Steve Evans and to you, that notwithstanding what the BBA certificate said about 12.7, K15 was not a material of limited combustibility? Was that not part of the evidential background to your decision?
Yes, and it was the reason we were having extensive discussions with Kingspan to gather further evidence.
Well, how would a meeting with Kingspan, even if they had provided further BS 8414 test evidence in respect of new particular systems, have assisted NHBC with projects that had already been signed off or were in the process of being considered, unless those systems were precisely the same?
The information from Kingspan was requested to support the changes made to the BBA certificate in 2014, because that did make it clear that it limited its use, and we wanted further test data to support the ongoing use of Kingspan.
That I understand, but did I take it from that evidence that the meeting with Kingspan would not enlighten you as to the historic position before the change in the BBA certificate? You weren't interested in that?
We were interested and we asked questions, and I believe that was the topics of discussion that Steve Evans had with Kingspan.
That comes back to a question I asked you just now, and indeed asked you yesterday. How would a meeting with Kingspan, even if they were to provide further test evidence in respect of different systems for the future, have answered the problem about 12.7, which had existed historically?
I think, as I mentioned yesterday, the concern with the certificate wasn't just the element around 12.7.
Well, that's the element I'm asking you about, just to focus on that. How would going to Kingspan and asking them about anything have assisted with the historical problem that you were prepared to proceed to permit your BCOs to sign off buildings as compliant based on that, based on the reference to 12.7 in the erstwhile BBA certificate?
And the condition that allowed reference back to the manufacturer. So that it was the two elements in conjunction that were being reviewed and discussed with Kingspan, because they were both equally important.
Yes, but they're separate, and I don't want to prolong this line of examination of you, Miss Marshall, but I want you, if you can, to separate them out. So first, how would asking Kingspan, well, what did you expect to get from Kingspan in these meetings about 12.7 and how it could come about that a phenolic insulation could be signed off as compliant with 12.7?
I obviously wasn't at the meetings, but my feedback, or the feedback from the meetings, was both points were discussed. It wasn't one point or the other. It was the entire composition of the certificate that was being discussed with Kingspan, not just one element of it.
Let's continue with the email. In the next paragraph, you say, there's no reason to suspect that buildings which have been built with Kingspan K15 are at risk at this time. It is just the fact that the testing carried out to date does not bear this out. Now, just keep that sentence in your mind, Miss Marshall, if you will. And then it goes on. Kingspan are confident that the testing currently underway will prove the suitability of the material for use over 18 metres. If they're not able to do this, we will begin the process of informing industry that the product is no longer suitable for use in facades over 18 metres, as well as informing other stakeholders, such as BCA and the Fire and Rescue Service, although both parties are already aware of our ongoing discussions. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but let's just look at NHB 50715, please. This is an email which, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you can see comes from Steve Evans to you with the draft in it. We looked at that yesterday, yes? Mm-hmm. And if you look at the email above that, it says slightly amended draft. Yes?
Yes.
And if you look lower down page 1 onto page 2, scroll onto page 2, you can see how you've amended it. We scroll to page 2, and there's the amendment. Well, sorry, there is some text in red. Is the text in red the addition by way of amendment that you made?
I don't believe I made the amendment. I believe Steve Evans made the amendment.
Right. So can you tell us then, looking at, let's start with page 1, please. Foot of page 1, over to page 2, and there's the rest of it on the screen. Can you tell us which parts you amended?
I don't believe I amended. I think Steve sent through an original and then amended his original with an updated draft.
Well, then what did you send back to him I see, I'm sorry. So the slightly amended draft was done by him. Is this right? After a discussion with you, yes?
I think we probably would have had a discussion.
Well, can you account for why there is an amendment that he's sending you, unless there had been a discussion?
No, I assume we had a discussion around it.
And going back to page 2, if we can, please, penultimate paragraph, the words in red there, was that sentence there put in there as a result of a discussion that you had with Steve Evans before he sent this back to you?
Quite probably, yes.
Right. Whose idea was it to tell Brian Martin in this response that there was no reason to suspect that buildings which have been built with Kingspan K15 are at risk at this time?
I think from the discussions that... Could we go back to the original email from Brian Martin, please?
The original email from Brian Martin is the 2nd of July. You want to see that one?
Yes, please.
Yes, I can do that. NHB 50712. And I'm so sorry, we'll need to head down to page... I'm so sorry, I've given you the wrong reference. Yes, that's right, 712, page 3, please. That's the one on the screen now. So that's what has come to you, and this is what this response is.
I think the addition was to address the observations within Brian's email around several buildings have been erected. And what we wanted to get across was that the situation prior to 2014 and also the situation where we'd got to with Kingspan in 2014, but confirmation that there weren't any projects post 1st of January 14 that had been accepted.
Was that right? Was it a fact that in that 7-month period, none of your building control officers had signed a certificate certifying as compliant a building over 18 metres containing K15 in its external wall build-up?
For projects submitted after the 1st of January 14, yes.
Oh, that's not what you said. You said the situation prior to 2014. I'd understand the period after 2014 in relation to new projects or projects in build. Of course, you've made that clear.
Yes.
But what are you telling us? Are you saying that you wanted to get across simply that fact?
Yes.
But how do you get that? Well, let's go back to the email I'm on, please, which is NHB 50715. Red sentence. How do you get that idea out of the red sentence?
Because those prior to 2014 had a BBA certificate, those post 2014 hadn't been completed.
Where's that? Forgive me. It says, I'll read it to you. There is no reason to suspect that buildings which have been built with Kingspan K15 are at risk at this time. It is just the fact that testing carried out to date does not bear this out. Just pause there. Where is the assertion that you say you were trying to get across that there had been no sign-offs on post 1st of January 2014 buildings?
I think it's in the preceding paragraphs.
I'm not asking you about the preceding paragraphs, Miss Marshall. I'm asking you about this sentence, which came to be added. Now, I'm going to focus you on that. Whose idea was it to tell Brian Martin the following: there is no reason to suspect that buildings which have been built with Kingspan K15 are at risk at this time. It is just the fact that the testing carried out to date does not bear this out. Whose idea was it to tell him that?
I think it was a discussion point that Steve Evans and I had. The information in the earlier body of the email sets out the background to 2013 and 2014, and that's a summary. So I think it needs to be read in conjunction with the earlier content within the email.
Well, what do you mean by buildings that have been built? What buildings? All buildings, historically, back to 2005?
Yes.
Right. So you're telling him that there's no reason to suspect, is this right, that a building over 18 metres containing Kingspan K15 signed off by your BCOs in 2012, for example, were at risk?
Yes, because they would have been assessed in accordance with the BBA certificate.
Well, given that I think hundreds of buildings that had used K15 above 80 metres had not used it in the one sole single specified tested construction which the BBA certificate spelt out, how could you possibly say there was no reason to suspect risk?
Again, on the basis of a valid BBA certificate.
Well, again, Miss Marshall, I don't think you say that. You don't say, we've come to the conclusion that buildings historically built with K15 are free of risk because we have a piece of paper saying that it complies with 12.7 and contact the manufacturer. Do you?
I think the last sentence of the paragraph at the top of the page sets out the basis that NHBC Building Control Services accepted the use of K15.
Indeed, it does. And you thought, did you, that that meant there was no risk or no reason to suspect risk, even though by now the certificate had changed?
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
Really? When it says that the issue is just that testing to date doesn't bear this out, you were, I think, accepting, weren't you, that the NHBC at that time had no test evidence to support the use of K15 over 18 metres on any existing or planned building?
The test evidence would have been the original test data from 2005.
Yes.
And the promises from Kingspan about their testing programme on a variety of wall makeups that would add to that database.
Yeah, but there was no test evidence to bear out the absence of risk. That's what you're saying. And I'm asking you whether you were implicitly at least accepting that NHBC had no evidence, no test evidence to support the use of K15 on any existing or planned building, because none of those buildings used exactly the same build-up as had been used in the 2005 test.
No, but our acceptance, as I've mentioned previously, was on the basis of a valid BBA certificate for those projects pre-2013.
Why did the absence of testing not pose a risk?
At this stage, as I've mentioned, Kingspan were committing to carrying out significant tests on a number of wall makeups that would have added to that and then allowed the configuration to be accepted in accordance with the BBA certificate.
What was the point of having tests and classifications if you could just assume that a product was safe in a tall building without any tests?
Well, there wasn't an assumption. It was based on reliable third-party certification.
I'm trying to understand that answer. You say there's no reason to suspect that the buildings which have been built with K15 are at risk at this time. It's just the fact that the testing carried out to date does not bear this out. It's the just that I'm having trouble with. Was that not a critical distinction? If there's no testing carried out to date to support the absence of risk, then you can't rule it out, can you?
I don't think the wording is, it could certainly be improved, but the way that I'm reading that is we've set out the background to why buildings were accepted prior to 2014. We've set out that those buildings that are being designed post-2014, there is no risk because they haven't been constructed.
Oh, that's not what you say.
No,
you
it's
don't
not.
say
It's not
there's no reason.
clear.
Well, let me put the point to you.
Apologies.
I'm putting to you the difference between this sentence and what you're now telling us, Miss Marshall. You don't say to Mr. Martin, there's no reason to suspect that the buildings currently in build, which propose Kingspan K15, are at risk. You could say that.
Yes.
And say, well, there's going to be further testing in the future. That's one thing, but you don't say that. What you're telling him is that there's no reason to suspect that the legacy of buildings going back many years which contain K15 are at risk. And that can't be right, given not least the fact that there was no testing to support it. I'm just asking you to accept a simple proposition.
Yeah, I accept the wording could be clearer.
But this was a carefully constructed email in response to a senior official in government after a number of days of consideration and after consideration by you and Mr. Evans and an amendment. Why was there this lack of clarity that you now tell us about?
I think that when this was written, it wasn't intended to go through. It was written to inform Brian in relation to his inquiry and to give him background, context, and our current understanding. And I fully accept that the wording could have been clearer.
Looking at the second part of that sentence, it's just the fact that the testing carried out to date does not bear this out. Kingspan are confident that the testing currently underway will, and then you say this, prove the suitability of the material for use over 18 metres. For use over 18 metres. Now, we, I think, established yesterday that you understood at the time that the BS8414 test was a system test, yes?
Yes.
Yes. So how could further testing to BS8414 possibly have served to prove the suitability of the material for use over 18 metres?
In the configurations that are tested.
Well, it doesn't say that, does it?
No, and I fully accept that the wording isn't as clear as it could be.
How would further testing to BS8414, which you were waiting for, have shown that it was generically safe for use over 18 metres? It wouldn't, would it?
It wouldn't, no.
But you say so, don't you? The suitability of material for use over 18 metres.
In the tested configuration, which again isn't in the statement, but is our understanding.
I just wonder why the wording was quite so different from your understanding at the time.
I don't think the wording is different. It's not as explicit as it could be.
But you see, wasn't the core of the problem which had come from Wintec, which you'd understood, and which option 3 in part was designed to solve, that Kingspan K15 was on all kinds of buildings across the country and had been historically, because it had been presented as suitable for use over 18 metres, without regard to the fact that it had to be of exactly the same configuration as that tested. That was the core of the problem. And I'd like you to explain to us why the nub of the problem isn't reflected in that sentence. You've fallen for exactly the same problem and perpetuated it that Kingspan had introduced originally.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
I'll make it a shorter question. Given that the historical problem was that Kingspan K15 could only be used in configurations in exactly the same form as that tested, but it had been sold on a far wider range of constructions, why did you not choose your words with complete care and make it clear to him that it was only going to be accepted on buildings which were exactly the same as those tested in these promised tests, as opposed to using the generic words for use over 18 metres? Do you understand the question?
I do understand the question, and I think the content of the entire body of the email sets that out. But I fully accept that the wording could have been improved.
I mean, can we agree at least this, that you didn't think at the time that Kingspan were planning on testing to 8414 every single build-up on which K15 either had been used historically over 18 metres, the hundreds that had, or every single build-up that was in build?
No.
No. Now, we've seen that you'd been advised by your fire engineer, John Lewis, in November 2013, that you should not be accepting K15 other than in external wall build-ups identical to the build-up tested. Yes? We saw that yesterday.
Yes.
Yes. So why, in the light of that warning from your own resident fire engineer, did you continue to accept it?
Again, on the basis of a valid BBA certificate that covered its historic use and the ongoing discussions we were having with Kingspan to address our concerns in relation to the 2014 certificate.
Do you accept that reading these sentences now sitting there, each of those two sentences is really quite absurd?
I accept it could be improved.
Did they not strike you as you put it, improvable at the time they went in red?
No, not at the time.
How carefully did you consider these red sentences that stick out in this draft?
It would have been in relation to the question that Brian asked, and were we providing a sufficient answer?
I'm going to suggest two things to you, Ms. Marshall, and then we move on. First, do you accept that it was your responsibility as Head of Technical Services to make the call to stop accepting K15, and you didn't do it?
I don't accept that. I accept that it would have been my responsibility to take a decision, absolutely. I don't accept that we continued accepting K15 on projects post-2014, because at this stage there wasn't any projects that were completed with K15.
Would it be fair to describe the position in July 2015 as the past is the past, BBA certificate, and the future is wait and see?
No.
Did you decide not to call a halt to using K15 because it would call into question the many historic buildings in respect of which Nhbc had accepted as compliant K15 above 18 metres?
No.
Let's turn to the Combustible Cladding Review in 2015. Do you know why it was called the Combustible Cladding Review?
No.
What were the products that were the focus of the review?
The main product was K15 and the later BBA certificate.
Right, not cladding panels, or did it include a review of cladding panels as well?
That was undertaken as part of the review, yes.
Now let's go to your statement, please. Page 26, paragraph 107. you say that the review referred to was undertaken to assess the implications of the change to the BBA certificate and the projects affected if the BBA certificate was deemed not to be adequate. This occurred in 2015, not 2014. Now, you're referring, I think, there to the change to the BBA certificate that occurred in December 2013, aren't you?
Correct.
And that's the one that removed the reference to 12.7 and consult the manufacturer, just to be clear for those listening. Now,
Yes.
Why did it take until 2015 for a review to be done?
There was ongoing engagement with Kingspan from January 14. There was lots of discussions and promises made in relation to testing programs, timescales, commitment to undertake tests, and accepting that testing does take some time. We allowed time for Kingspan to gather further evidence. We did get to a point via the regular meetings that Steve had with Kingspan that we were pushing for testing. Testing wasn't becoming apparent. We were pushing for further evidence from either ARIPS or BRE. And when it got to the stage where that wasn't forthcoming and projects were advancing, we took the decision that this needed a review.
When you say in your statement at this paragraph that the purpose of the review was to assess the implications of the change to the BBA certificate and the projects affected if the BBA certificate was deemed not to be adequate, what do you mean by that?
The changes to the certificate and the timescale, so pre-2013 being covered by the BBA certificate, post-2014 not being covered.
When you say if the BBA certificate was deemed not to be adequate, what do you mean?
The wording within the certificate.
Yeah, well, the process of deeming it not to be adequate, what's that about?
The removal of the reference to the certificate holder would mean that the certificate was then limited to the single test that was covered by the later BBA certificate.
I'm sorry, it's my fault. I'm not asking you the clearest of questions. Okay. You say, if the BBA certificate was deemed not to be adequate, in what eventuality would the certificate be deemed not to be adequate?
That it didn't cover the scenario. So
who would do the deeming?
The surveyors assessing the projects against the latest BBA certificate relevant for that project.
So which BBA certificate are you referring to? I had understood that was a reference to the certificate that had pertained until December 2013. Is that not right?
No, that's the certificate post-2014.
What was the problem with that certificate?
The removal of the clause that allowed reference back to the certificate holder.
Was there forgive me, I hadn't realised that was a problem. Was there a problem in removing that clause that NHBC thought existed?
Yes.
Why?
The removal of the clause then limited the use of K15 to the one tested scenario within the BBA certificate.
Indeed, but why would the BBA certificate, which did not contain a consult the manufacturer provision, be at risk of being, as you put it, deemed not to be adequate?
Because it would only reference the tested system and the limitations on the use of the BBA certificate were narrowed.
Oh, I see. So by adequate, you mean enough to allow a building control officer to sign off K15?
Yes.
I see. And let's go to your statement, please, 109, at the top of page 26. Just below this. Steve Evans, you say, pulled together a team of specialists across NHBC, including John Lewis, Phil Pettinger, Dave Alexander-White and Gary Jarvis. It was a case of going through a database and investigating which projects since 2014 has used products such as K15 and RS5000. The purpose of the review was to make sure that the projects complied with NHBC's policy of using one of the routes outlined in the BCA guidance note as detailed in Steve Evans' email of 13th of February 2015. So it was the purpose of the review to assess the implications of the change to the BBA certificate. Or was it to make sure the projects complied with Technical Guidance Note 18? Which was it?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, certainly. Was the purpose of the review to assess the implications of the change to the BBA certificate, as you say in 107, or was it to make sure projects complied with Technical Guidance Note 18, as you say in 109?
It was both.
Was the decision to conduct that review made in discussions with the NHBC board?
Yes.
And what was the reasoning at board level, so far as you could detect it, for the review?
The communications with Kingspan had come to a point where there was frustration that information wasn't being provided. And I believe that Steve Evans and Graham Perrier briefed myself and Mark Jones in I think it was the October 2014, about where the process had got to. That instigated communication with ARIPS and BRE to validate the claims being made by Kingspan. Those meetings took place towards the end of 2014 and confirmed that neither party were in a position to offer what Kingspan had promised. At that point, it was decided between myself and Mark Jones, he was head of standards at that stage, that it needed to be escalated to the executive director and the main NHBC board.
Were you party to the discussions at board level?
No.
Do you know from what you know whether there was discussion at board level of the corporate risks to NHBC arising from signing off as compliant buildings over 18 metres which had used non-compliant combustible materials in the external wall build-up?
I believe that was discussed.
What's the basis of your belief?
I think I've seen some of the minutes of the board meeting.
Right. And was there a discussion about the possibility of this being a significant legacy problem?
I believe the report that was presented to the board, which was there was a report on combustible materials that set out the timeline of events with all of the interactions with Kingspan and a number of recommendations. And that report was put forward to the board for consideration. And at that stage, it set out clearly our position on pre-2013 and post-2014.
And what was your pre-2013, pre-December 2013 position that you set out to the board in summary, without the document?
The basis of the BBA certificate.
Right. Did anybody actually tell the board that there was a significant risk arising from the historical legacy of K15 being approved by your building control officers for use on tall buildings?
I think the executive directors, when they were briefed, fully understood the background and the situation and asked relevant questions.
So, to your knowledge and understanding at the time, was it your understanding that the main board, the executive directors of NHBC, understood that although K15 was a combustible material, nonetheless a BBA certificate said it wasn't, and therefore there was no legacy problem?
To summarise, yes.
Were there any, out of interest, were there any fire engineers or fire experts on your board?
Not to my knowledge.
So they were entirely reliant on what you were telling them?
They were reliant on the feedback through the report and the briefing that was carried out to the executive directors by Steve Evans and Graham Perrier.
Now, you say in your witness statement that the results of the review are set out in the Combustible Materials Control Table, and Steve Evans told us in his evidence, we don't need to go to it, it's day 221, page 19, lines 22 and onwards, that the only projects currently, it was only projects currently under construction or those about to start that were included in that review.
Correct.
That's how you understood it, is it?
Yes.
Yes. And he also told us that the review looked at the entire wall makeup, so not just insulation. I think you agree with that too.
Correct.
He also told us that buildings for which construction was already complete were not included in the review. Yes?
Correct.
Yes. And he told us that he'd received instructions not to include those buildings, either from you or from Ian Davis. Is that correct?
Yes, the instruction came on the back of the board meeting in terms of the required actions going forward.
Did it come to him from you, or did it come to him from Ian Davis?
I believe it was Ian Davis.
Right. What, direct to him? Or
There was ongoing dialogue between Ian and Steve because Steve had been involved in all of the Kingspan meetings and was taking the lead for NHBC on the review, so was in the best position to brief Ian and the other executive directors on what had happened previously.
Yes, and you were privy, a party to those briefing sessions or notes, were you?
Not all of them, no.
Right. Why is that? Why were you, to some extent, not in that loop?
Because Steve was an experienced, trusted member of the team, more than capable of dealing with the issue and more than capable of reporting to the executive directors.
And was the reason that the decision was made, well, prior question, was the decision made by the board after discussion not to include pre-December 2013 certifications?
I believe so.
Right. And was the reason that the board made that decision the one that you've given us, that there was a BBA certificate?
That would have informed their thinking, yes.
Well, what else would have informed their thinking?
The position in relation to once a project is completed for building control purposes, there are limited powers that a building control body can introduce. The completion certificate concludes their role.
Right. To your knowledge, was it any ingredient of the thinking leading to the decision that NHBC might have some general responsibility to warn its historic customers who put up tall buildings for people to live in, that those buildings had contained in their walls a non-compliant combustible insulation material? Did that inform the thinking?
I believe that would have been discussed at the board.
What's the basis of that belief?
I think there was something in the minutes.
Right, do you? And although it was discussed, is this right? The decision was taken at board level not to tell NHBC's historical customers that there was a legacy of tall buildings out there with people living in them which contained combustible insulation in the external wall build-up.
Which had been accepted on the basis of a valid certificate.
But I think the answer is yes, BVA certificate.
Yes.
Now, is it right that by early 2016, jumping forward a year, were you aware that there were many buildings over 18 metres with ACM with 100% PE core in the tall buildings population?
In general?
In general.
I think we were aware of some projects that were being proposed with ACM.
Were you aware that there were some, at least in the industry, who regarded that fact as the fact of the presence of ACM so ubiquitously as a grave concern?
There was discussions with the likes of Arup that were, because we engaged them on a project review that identified their concerns and supported our concerns in relation to the use of PE called ACM.
Can I show you what John Lewis told the inquiry on day 225? So yesterday, please, yesterday's transcript. And I'd like to take you, please, to page 44. And on page 44, at line 6, he says, at this point in time, and this is post-15 review, which would have picked up everything that was in build up to that point. We didn't do a separate review, in February 16 to repeat what had already been done. That wasn't carried out. But our surveyors, we were saying this clearly. The major projects team was then put together. The large buildings was then being dealt with by a much smaller pool of people, and they were all well aware of the risks of PE called ACM. Question. But you are now well aware of at least the possibility that there was a legacy of Nhbc building control officer approved buildings which had ACM PE core on the exterior. Answer, we were aware that there were a number of buildings that had it on, yes. And you didn't do anything to alert the building owners to the dangers. Answer, well, I know you don't like me to say that this was not my role, but it wasn't my role. That would have been left to people above me to instruct or to do that. So me personally, no, I did not. Question, no, but did you advise your seniors that this should be done, given the coalescence of knowledge, as we can see from Nick Jenkins' email early in 2016? Did you say to Steve Evans or Diane Marshall, for example, look, there is a legacy problem out there. There are buildings we've approved which contain PE called ACM, which is dangerous or potentially dangerous. We should tell the building owners. Did you do that? Answer, I didn't spell it out because they were as aware as I was that these buildings were there. And then they might say, well, we were reliant on you as the resident fire engineer. What would you say to them? Answer, they were aware that these buildings were there because we'd identified a number of them when we did the 2015 review. We'd highlighted the fact, that we put those as high risk in the 2015 review, They'd been at we hadn't done the Cladding Facades conference, but they knew my thoughts on all of this. Steve definitely was well aware of the risks of 100% PE called ACM. It was, by that point, we were banging on about it every time we discussed this with any of our surveying teams. It was not, yes, they were well aware. Now, I've read you quite a long passage, and there may be parts of which you disagree with, but would you disagree with anything that Mr. Lewis told us yesterday?
Yes.
What? Which parts?
If you could scroll back up, please.
To page 44, please.
I think the answer to at line 6, the 2015 review, when it was carried out, actually predated the change in BBA certificate and did all projects in build both post 2013 and post 2014. Mm-hmm. That project review was an opportunity to look at how our surveyors had assessed both the issue around the insulation, but also how they had applied the requirements of the cladding material. So what we talked about yesterday on filler, etc., those aspects were also assessed to see that surveyors were applying our understanding of the broader definition. What did come to light through that review was that I think there was a split between the building control projects and the warranty-only projects. And what did come to light through that review was that on the warranty-only projects, our project managers who looked after the warranty weren't checking fire safety. That would have been down to the building control body. They would have been assessing other aspects of the cladding system in relation to standards, so drained and vented and other aspects. And what did come to light was in those situations, we weren't aware of the fire safety risk on warranty-only schemes. And by doing the review, it introduced through the B500 guidance the fact that we would take that approach on all warranty schemes going forward to ensure that not only the building control body were looking at fire safety, but Nhbc were considering the implications of the fire safety and assessing the cladding material.
Is there anything else in what I've read to you from Mr. Lewis's evidence with which you would disagree?
I think that context sort of puts this into place because, yes, there were high risk, and from my recollection, majority of those were in relation to warranty-only projects.
Are you saying that there were no projects at all on which building control services were provided by Nhbc, which featured an aluminium a PE called aluminium rain screen?
without interrogating the spreadsheet, I couldn't say for definite, but certainly the feedback from the review team was that all of those projects were assessed, and where they were assessed and we didn't feel that they met the criteria, they would be looked at through an option 3 or an option 4 report.
Now let's turn to option 3. We haven't gone through the 2014 edition, issue 0, of Technical Guidance Note 18, but let's look at issue 1, which was published in June 2015. And again, I take it you're familiar with the document.
Yes.
And can I take it that you know that there were 2 principal amendments made, first in relation to those people who could complete option 3 reports, that was widened, yes?
Yes.
Yes. And secondly, adding option 4, the
Yes.
acceptance of holistic fire engineering reports, yes?
Yes.
Yes. Now let's look at the first of those, page 33 of your statement, paragraph 146, please. You say there, a further amendment to the Technical Guidance Note issue 1 was to widen the bodies who could provide option 3 assessments. In issue 0, this was limited to a UKAS accredited testing body, BRE, Chiltern Fire or Warrington Fire, but in the 2015 BCA Guidance Note, that was amended to a suitably qualified fire specialist. I understand the reason for this was because the amended wording was consistent with approved document B. Now, the last sentence there, I understand the reason for this was because the amended wording was consistent with approved document B. What does it mean? What does that sentence mean?
That the change in wording to option 3 was updated to reflect the content of the approved document around the ability of those undertaking option 3 reports or extended applications.
Are you saying that the unamended form of words in issue 0 was not consistent with ADB?
From recollection, the original addition was the UKAS testing bodies, and when it was revisited by the BCA technical group, I understand that they reviewed that against the actual wording within the approved document.
I see. Is in fact what you mean here is that despite the widening of the bodies who could provide option 3 assessments, it was still consistent with approved document B?
Yes.
Yes, I see. And now Steve Evans said in his statement, and there's no reason to go to it unless you want to see it, but the reason for the amendment was due to the backlog of work at the BRE. And that is something that Steve Evans told John Lewis about, according to John Lewis as well, his evidence at day 224, page 11194. Again, no need to go to it. As a general proposition, do you accept that? The reason for the amendment was due to the backlog of work at the BRE.
I've no reason to question what Steve Evans has said.
No, but from your own knowledge.
I wouldn't have known. I didn't engage with BRE, so I wouldn't be aware of that firsthand.
Right. Did you ask Steve Evans or John Lewis what the reason for that amendment was?
No, that they would have stated that when they were discussing this with the BCA technical group, I would have assumed.
I see. Did you yourself not engage with the reason?
No, it was led by the BCA technical group.
Yes. Did you not want to understand why it was that this select, very small pool of experts who had previously been identified as those fit to carry out option 3 reports was now being widened?
I think the discussions would have been held at the technical group, and then when it was reported to the BCA executive, in terms of an update, there was nobody that raised any observations around that wording.
Well, you say it was led by the BCA technical group. It was drafted by John Lewis, your John Lewis.
Yes, on behalf of Steve Evans, who was the BCA technical group chairman, and utilised whatever resources were necessary to support the work of the BCA.
Yes, but given that it had come from within your organisation, were you not interested to understand what lay behind the amendment?
Well, I would have found that out once it was presented to the BCA executive, assuming it went through suitable challenge with the technical group.
I think you say in your statement, paragraph 174, that that the historical experience of these desktop assessments up to this time, June 2015, had been substandard. Some of them had been substandard, yes?
Yes, there was an issue with some of the quality of some of the submissions.
Yes. Why did you think it was all right to widen the pool of those completing these reports when thus far some of them had fallen below the requisite standards that you'd expected?
That wasn't my decision.
No, maybe not, but what was in your head? Can you explain yourself why the pool was widened given that consideration?
Only that it reflected the wording within the approved document.
Right, but you didn't have to widen the pool just because the approved document said that you could on your reading, did you? Or did the BCA?
No.
No. Now, you were on the BCA executive board, weren't you?
Yes.
As such, did you examine it and critique it? Critique the amendment?
The amendment would have been reported to the executive by Steve's regular attendance at the meetings to give an update on what the technical group were doing, and it would be challenged by member bodies of the BCA executive, but on the basis that it had already been through a robust process within the technical group, and the technical group having a number of members from both ACAI and LABC in reviewing the content and the detail.
What was the robust process within the technical group?
Well, I can't speak with authority because I'm not part of the technical group, but I would have assumed that that would have been open discussion, debate and challenge.
What was the process whereby this amendment was considered? I'm not asking you for the precise discussions, I just want to know the process.
Any member of the BCA representative bodies could raise a question on any complex technical or procedural matter. That would be fed through to a working group. On a technical matter, it would be the BCA technical group. They would investigate the matter. They would come up with a consensus view on a way forward and produce guidance notes that would then be published and available to all the representative bodies.
And are you, moving on with the next question, are you able to tell us how, in the instance of this amendment, that process worked?
Well, as described.
But from your own knowledge, is that how it worked?
Yes, I would have seen Steve provide an update to the BCA executive.
Yeah, and Steve was a member of the BCA, wasn't he?
The BCA technical group?
Yes.
Yes, he was the chairman.
And it came through to the executive board, yes?
Yes.
Yes. And at that stage, did you yourself ask those sitting around the table, notionally or otherwise, what the basis for this amendment was and the reason for it?
I believe it was explained by Steve when he was presenting the updated technical guidance note.
And did you not ask the question, well, why are we widening the pool of those eligible to perform these desktop assessments in circumstances where we have reservations about their quality?
No.
Why is that?
Because it reflected the wording within the approved document.
Is that all?
Yes. Just because the quality of what we were receiving wasn't, in all cases, to the right standard, that wouldn't mean that we would accept them. They would still be challenged, they would still be analysed and assessed on a case-by-case basis. So regardless of who was submitting these reports, they would still be interrogated.
Let's look then at the discussions that were had with Brian Martin a little bit before this, in April 2015, NHB 401057. This is an email exchange between NHBC and Brian Martin in that month, in that year, April 2015. And the first email in the chain is the 2nd of April 2015 at the foot of page 1. If we can go to that, please. You can see it's from Steve Evans to Brian Martin, to copy to you, Graham Perrier and Ian Davis. Update on combustible materials in the envelope of buildings over 18 metres. And you can see what he says. It's quite brief, but goes over the page. I hope you're well. I'm conscious we've not provided an update on our progress with the manufacturers of combustible insulation materials that are marketed as being suitable for use in buildings over 18 metres for some time, and I must apologise for this. But this has been an extremely complicated process in ensuring that the information we provide to our builders is correct and allows them as much flexibility to demonstrate compliance as is possible. And then over the page 2, he refers to previous communications written to our builder customers, and then refers to internal guidance in the next paragraph. You can see that, yes?
Yes.
And then he says in this paragraph, with respect to insulation-type materials, of which Kingspan K15 and Celotex RS5000 are the most common we encounter, this would mean that following options 2 and 3 from the BCA guidance note, and then he explains what option 2 and 3 respectively are. You see that?
Yes.
We've also added a further option of a full fire-engineered solution for the complete building, and we will be taking this to the BCA as a suggestion to add to the guidance note. As a result of these actions, Nhbc has begun to see submissions from builders mainly following option 3, and then in the next paragraph he says that they've continued to liaise with Kingspan and Celotex, etc. Now, the response from Brian Martin comes at the top of the chain, and he writes as follows. It's the 7th of April 2015, and again copied to you. Thanks for this, Steve. If there are common solutions that people are using for the, quotes, engineered approach, I would be interested to hear about them. It might be that we could adopt them in future editions of the AD. There does seem to have been some confusion in the market, whether some polymer insulation materials are combustible or not. I guess I shouldn't be that surprised. Anything you can do to raise awareness has got to be a good thing. Is Nhbc content that the existing projects you've dealt with meet these principles? I understood that there had been some questions raised. Brian. Now, it's the last paragraph there I want to ask you about. As a fact, were you content that existing projects that you dealt with had met the principles of the BCA guidance note?
Sorry, could you scroll down, please?
Yes, we can scroll down.
Thank you.
Page 2.
I'm trying to establish if Brian is asking about the principles of our policy or the BCA guidance note.
Well, I've read you as much as I can,
Yes.
Ms. Marshall, I'm afraid. You'll have to help me. You received both of these emails. What did you understand he meant at the time?
I thought he meant our policy, and I recall, I think Steve went back to Brian to ask if there was any particular projects that Brian had concerns over.
Well, did you understand, but with the word existing, Brian Martin meant those which were already on foot before the publication of the Technical Guidance Note 18 in June 2014?
Sorry, could you scroll back up, please?
It's the last sentence there. Is Nhbc content that the existing projects you've dealt with meet these principles?
As I say, I believe that Steve went back to ask Brian to clarify if there were any projects that he had concerns over, but assuming that he had sent him a copy of the policy, it would have been in the policy what we had done.
Yes, I'm not sure you're wrong to say that there was a later question about whether there were particular concerns that Mr. Martin had, but what I'm asking you is what you understood when you received these two emails. First is the question, had you met those principles? Had those existing projects that you dealt with met those principles?
The policy principles, yes.
And by existing projects, what did you understand Mr. Martin to mean?
I haven't given it the degree of thought that you've asked, but it would have been projects that NHBC would have been involved with.
So did NHBC's projects it had been involved with meet the requirement or guidance of having external wall build-ups of limited combustibility, or an external wall build-up tested to 8414 meeting the compliance criteria of BR 135, or a satisfactory desktop assessment report using sufficient large-scale fire test data?
From 2014 onwards, yes. Prior to 2014, there was reliance on the product certification. However, some of those 2013 projects that were still in build when we carried out the review were also revisited to establish that the external cladding system had been assessed as we discussed earlier.
In the last sentence, he says, I understood that there had been some questions raised. Do you know what he was referring to?
No, and I think that's why Steve went back to him to ask if there was examples that he had concerns over.
Well, I think that's later in the piece. But did you, as head of building control, not think it your responsibility to find out what questions were being raised about the work of those in your department?
No, again, Steve Evans was very capable of engaging with officials. He was dealing with his project nigh on a day-to-day basis and was very familiar with the content and able to respond to the questions.
We can't see from the documents we've had that anybody responded to this email, the one I'm showing you on page 1 on your screen of the 7th of April 2015. Do you know if anybody from NHBC actually answered his question?
I don't recall answering, but I don't know if Steve Evans did.
Well, on the assumption that the documents we have from NHBC are complete, there was no response to this question. Can you explain why?
No.
Now before the break, Mr. Chairman, can I just do this email?
Yes.
I think it'd be convenient where it fits here. NHB 402791, please. This is a little later in the same year, Miss Marshall, 2015, August. It's an email, if you scroll down, please, to the very foot of page 1. You can just see it. It's from, this one at the top is from you to John Lewis of the 7th of August, and also to Steve Evans, copy to Ian Davis, yes. And it responds, if you go to page 2, to an email from John Lewis to you and Steve Evans, subject K15 used with aluminium facade. Hello both. I attended a meeting with Sotec on Tuesday. They manufacture aluminium, not composite, cladding systems. Their system holds approval when used with rock wool insulation. They also showed me a BS8414 Part 2 test, which used K15 behind a 2mm aluminium finish, which was funded equally between Kingspan, Sotec and another party, I forget who, in 2008. It failed within 15 minutes, with flames coming off the top of the test rig. A few months ago, Sotec got a call from Kingspan telling them that they'd take legal action against them if they released the test report. My problem is that, 1, Kingspan have never mentioned it. 2, Kingspan have been reluctant to our request that they undertake a test using aluminium. 3, we've seen assessments from BRE which are based on the terracotta and Eternit board tests, and the results extrapolated to aluminium with the conclusion that in their view it should perform acceptably when tested to BS8414. Either BRE have ignored or been instructed to ignore the earlier Sotec test, or, as it was some time ago, the current staff are unaware of it. I know that our backs are covered by BRE's assessment report, but I still have doubts about how the fire performance of a lightweight metal has been assessed on the basis of an inert, inorganic material. And knowing that Kingspan are wanting to cover up tests which they aren't happy to share, I just have a feeling that the use of an aluminium facade and K15 may not be as good as we're led to believe. And then if you go to page 3, happy to elaborate more on Tuesday. First, do you recall any discussions within NHBC arising from the contents of Mr. Lewis's email to you?
We had a meeting on the Tuesday, John, Steve and myself, to review all of the escalations and option 3 reports, and I believe we discussed the content of this at that meeting. And you discussed the content. What was the upshot of that discussion? I believe that John Lewis was going to go away and do some further research on this matter and engage with either BRE or Exover, I believe. And did you do anything further other than asking him to go away and research it? No, he went away to find out the basis of some of the analysis that had been provided, and from what I understand with his engagement through Exover, obtained some reassurance around the way that the option 3 reports were being assessed. Did you report these concerns to Ian Davis? I think Ian Davis was copied in. He was copied into the top email, you're quite right, he was. But did you report them to him after the discussion on Tuesday? I probably would have updated him, yes, but he was aware of the issue because of being copied into the email. I know, but you said you then had a meeting on the Tuesday. Yes. And did you update Ian Davis after the meeting on Tuesday? I would have done, yes. You would have done. And what about the NHBC board? Was it, to your knowledge, made alert to this potential problem? What was the date of this email, sorry? Well, 6th of August, it comes to you and Steve Evans, and 7th of August is when you send it on to John Lewis and Steve Evans, copied to Ian Davis. There were regular updates provided to the board through 2015. I think the date after this one would have been September. As a result, at least, of this information, did you make any decision to review which buildings you had previously approved or had granted warranties on, which contained lightweight metal as the cladding and K15 as the insulation? That would have been part of the review meeting on the Tuesday, as a matter of course, because we were going through project by project. I see. So you sat down and looked to see which those projects were? Yes, there was a master spreadsheet that Steve Evans managed that captured all of the escalations. Yes, and those were all those in build, post, or those for which the initial notice had been received after the 1st of January 2014. Correct, although there was a number of projects in build prior to 2014 that were also considered. Right, and what about those that had been completed before 31st of December 2013? No. No. And again, why no decision to look at those, given what you had now learned from SOTEC? It required further investigation in terms of the statements made by SOTEC. They needed to be validated, and that's what John Lewis was tasked to do, to go away and find out more about the basis of some of the option 3 reports that were being prepared by the likes of Exover and BRE. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, I think it is. Thank you very much. Well, I think it's time we had a break. Ms. Marshall, we'll stop there. We'll resume at 25 to 12, please. And again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence when you're away from the room. Thank you. Thank you. 25 to 12, please. Would you ask Ms Marshall to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Ms Marshall, ready to carry on?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you
Yes.
very much. Yes, Mr. Miller.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ms Marshall, I'd like now to look at the 2016 guidance note, the Common Constructions note, entitled in full, The Acceptability of Common Wall Constructions Containing Combustible Materials in High-Rise Buildings. Now, I think you will agree that this was released at a conference in London on the 7th of July 2016, yes?
Correct.
Yes, and that was at NHBC's offices. In your statement, can we go to it? It's paragraph 178 at the bottom of page 38. This is what you say about the guidance underneath the heading, Production of the 2016 Guidance Note. And you say this: a large number of builders were using the BCA Guidance Note and therefore putting forward options 3 and 4 reports to consider. NHBC, and I suspect other building control bodies, was facing a significant increase in workload reviewing those reports. It was discussed internally at NHBC, and we decided to hold a seminar to explain what the BCA Guidance Note meant. During the discussions prior to this seminar, a document was produced in order to look at what could be done. We felt it was appropriate for NHBC to offer guidance on this. That note eventually became the 2016 Guidance Note. We considered it appropriate because we were receiving a significant number of Option 3 reports for very similar wall makeups. As a result, there was a lot of repetition, and we wanted to help the industry understand NHBC's requirements in terms of evidence to show compliance with the BCA Guidance Note. Now, you say that the purpose of the seminar was to explain what the BCA Guidance Note meant. Had you had feedback that the BCA Guidance Note, the 2015 edition as it by now it had become, was not clear and needed explanation?
As a consequence of the work that John Lewis was doing, he was spending an awful lot of time on Option 3 and 4 reports, and was feeding back that the quality of those reports wasn't particularly good, and that people weren't understanding the basis of how they should submit an Option 3 and 4 report. So this was done to promote not only the BCA Guidance Note, but the regulatory position, the industry view, and some experts that were producing these reports in conjunction with NHBC to set out what was expected. And that was the reason we wanted external speakers to come in to put things into context.
What do you mean in that answer by promote the regulatory position, the industry view?
Brian Martin coming along to talk about it with an MHCLG view on what the approved document be required, and explain that to the audience, and then lead into, I think it was BRE that followed Brian Martin, and then Exover, and Steve Evans did an update on the BCA Guidance Note, and then John Lewis and Malik Katkoria did an update on the guide that was produced.
So, to answer my question, picking it out of the answer if I can, the problem which gave rise to the 2016 Guidance Note, is this right, was that people preparing desktop assessments weren't doing them well, wasn't particularly good, and weren't understanding the basis on how they should submit an Option 3 report.
That was certainly evident to us, but not in all cases. You know,
No.
there were some good submissions, there were some poor submissions.
Right, and just focusing on the words you used in the answer, people weren't understanding the basis on how they should submit an Option 3 report. Was it evident to you that they didn't understand what was required of them by way of analysis, methodology, techniques, data? Or was it something else?
I think there was, certainly from feedback from John Lewis, there was a lack of reference to the test data that was being used, but there was still the occasional report that was applying the limited requirements for diagram 40 and not looking at filler, etc., in its broadest terms.
Oh, that's interesting. So some reports were coming back from these specialists which focused only on the Class B or Class 0 requirement for external panels, and in your mind ignoring the need for those panels to be of limited combustibility.
It would have been the consideration, and they would have to justify how they had extrapolated any data to include anything that varied from that standard.
Right. So could one summarise the view of NHBC in the summer of 2016 about the success of option 3 as mixed, qualified?
No, I think option 3 worked well as long as you received a good standard report. It took several iterations in some cases to get to that standard, but the process of an option 3 report was a suitable way of demonstrating compliance as long as it was done correctly.
Did not the fact that there was a sufficiently significant number of option 3 reports coming back that needed this further work or were inadequate in the ways you've identified not indicate to you either that the pool of people doing them was insufficiently qualified by virtue of your amendment, or wasn't possible to achieve to a sufficient degree of quality across the board?
The variety of people that submitted the reports, including qualified and experienced fire engineers, would still be subject to review on a case-by-case basis and would not be accepted until they did achieve the required quality.
Well, that's not an answer to my question. My question is this. I'll put it more simply, come mid-16, were you of the view that option 3 wasn't working well enough, notwithstanding the purported expertise of those you had identified who could produce them?
No, option 3
Why
was
is that?
a viable option. It
Viable.
created an awful lot of work, It created a lot of work in reviewing the reports, but when they were to the required standard, it was an adequate and acceptable route to compliance.
So was the 2016 guidance a response to the lack of quality that you were seeing in the ways you've described, or was it a response to the administrative burden that reviewing them had placed on your team?
It was a bit of both.
Did that not tell you that it had not been an overall success and a remedy needed to be found?
No, this is, with any large building control project, there are lots of bits of information that need to be provided to the building control body, and the process of any building control body is to assess that information and ask for further information if it's lacking. That's a common approach within building control, that very rarely do you get a full compliant design on day one, and you manage it through the process of conditions and asking further questions. So this was common to every aspect of the build, not just fire safety.
So it sounds from paragraph 178 on page 38 that the 2016 guidance note was created as a way to cut John Lewis's workload and those in his team.
The original discussions around the guidance note were on the basis that we were seeing several reports around brickwork, and brickwork with a combustible insulation didn't meet option 1 or option 2 because there'd never been a test. So that was the basis for the guidance, that actually it would reduce a lot of the repetition of option 3 reports proving a brickwork facade.
Right. Brickwork, all right. So just teasing out what you really mean here, was this 2016 guidance note really aimed at cutting John Lewis's workload for brickwork build-ups, brickwork facades?
That was the original intention, that brickwork is a fairly robust construction, and again, within the approved documents, there is an allowance for past experience deemed to satisfy or akin to deemed to satisfy. And that was something that was discussed with Brian Martin, who confirmed his view that it was akin to that process. So if you have past experience of buildings performing, you can then accept that on future projects. So the brickwork facade was the basis of asking, could we do anything to alleviate the volume and the repetition that was being carried out?
Now, we know that it was NHBC who put this seminar on.
Yes.
Why did the BCA not put this seminar on, given that the purpose was to explain what its guidance note meant, as you say there in paragraph 178?
It was broader than the BCA guidance note. As I explained, there was a desire to update the industry on the regulatory position, the expert opinions, and the guidance note. And Steve Evans had, I believe, attended several seminars to update on the BCA guidance note, wearing his BCA hat. It was something that NHBC felt it was appropriate to do to its customers to inform them of the current thinking.
So it wasn't updating the industry, it was updating its customers? Or is that,
Well, it was
or is that a distinction without a difference?
It was updating its customers. The attendance was targeted towards NHBC customers. We invited industry experts to provide that update.
Was the BCA involved at all in the creation of this note, this guidance note?
No.
Was it involved at all in the convening of the conference?
They would have been made aware of Steve's attendance at a range of conferences and seminars talking as BCA.
Given that the guidance note was the solution to a problem that option 3 had created, as I think you've told us, why not involve BCA, given that its members, who are not NHBC people, were also entitled at least to rely on option 3?
We based the guidance note on our personal experience of reviewing option 3 and option 4 reports. So it was based on the evidence that we had seen. I don't know what other evidence other building control bodies would have seen and what guidance they would have given to their staff to adopt or approach the BCA guidance note.
Was there a conscious decision made at NHBC not to involve BCA in the facade conference or the production of this guidance note?
This guidance note was targeted to our customers.
My question again, was a conscious decision made by NHBC not to involve the BCA in either the conference or the production of the note?
Well, BCA were involved in the conference because Steve Evans attended as the chair of the BCA technical group, and the BCA executive were aware of the conference and his attendance. There wasn't any conscious decision to exclude BCA, but the guidance note was created for NHBC customers.
Was any conscious decision made not to involve the BCA, its technical group perhaps, in the creation of the guidance note itself?
It was for NHBC customers.
Yes, yes, and NHBC, as we know, was represented by Steve Evans on BCA. So was the BCA, as the body who put out Technical Guidance Note 18, involved at all in the production of the guidance note?
No.
And was that as a result of a conscious decision made by you?
It was addressing an issue that NHBC wanted to address based on its experience of the use of the BCA guidance note.
I appreciate that. My question, one more time, was the non-involvement of the BCA in the creation of the 2016 guidance note the result of a conscious decision by you?
No.
So it just happened, did it, that you didn't involve them? But you didn't decide not to involve them?
No. We felt that the BCA were represented with Steve Evans attending as the chair of the BCA technical group.
Did you actually address your mind to the question, should we involve the BCA in the creation of this document?
No.
Why is that?
NHBC looks at technical policy on a regular basis, and not in every situation will that be shared with the broader industry. It could be addressing a specific issue that NHBC experience based on the submission of projects that it sees.
Now let's go to the note. It's at NHB 6065, please. And you can see the title at the top of the page, and you can see in the right-hand column, BCA Guidance Note 18, Option 3 Assessments, and what's said there. Option 3 is quoted, as you can see in the words in italics, yes? And then lower down that column, there are two final paragraphs there. And the last paragraph says, however, it's recognised that it's unlikely that a building will only have a single facade type, and so where other facade types are utilised, it will continue to be necessary to provide justification under BCA Guidance Note 18 for those facade types not featured in this guidance note. And then you have this, common wall and facade types accepted by NHBC. The following common wall and facade constructions are acceptable to NHBC without the need to provide an Option 3 assessment, providing that the design specification and installation meets the minimum specifications set in the following appendices. And you have 3. Appendix 1, brickwork facade. Appendix 2, timber panelling. Appendix 3, aluminium composite panels. So just pausing there, is it right that the intention of this document was to do away with Option 3 assessments in circumstances where the design specification and installation met the minimum specifications set out in each of those applicable appendices?
Yes, the original intention was to address the brickwork facade, and when it was discussed with John Lewis and Steve Evans, John offered that additional finishes could be included based on his assessment of projects.
Just let's look at paragraph 180 of your statement at para 39 to clear away one wrinkle. If you go to that page, paragraph 180 says, the 2016 guidance note provided additional information on the options in the BCA guidance note, and in particular set out what we wanted from NHBC's customers. Unlike the BCA document, it was not an industry-wide guidance. Now, just focusing on the first sentence there, how did the 2016 guidance note give additional information on technical guidance note 18? What additional information was it providing?
It was providing the equivalent of a deemed to satisfy approach to an Option 3 report. It
wasn't providing additional information on how to go about producing an Option 3 assessment, was it?
No.
No. So it wasn't, in fact, filling in the gaps or the defects or addressing the defects that you had experienced through the Option 3 reports that you had seen up to that point, was it?
That was an improving picture because of our ongoing involvement with fire engineers producing Option 3 reports. And I believe that the standard was improving, but this set out a deemed to satisfy approach that would set a minimum standard for an Option 3 report to be considered.
Well, is the answer to my question yes? It wasn't telling those who were charged with producing desktop assessments how to do them better, was it?
No.
No. Indeed, it was doing the opposite. It was saying you don't need to do Option 3 reports anymore where the products and dimensions proposed in the appendices are present.
Yes, adopting a deemed to satisfy approach.
Now, Steve Evans told us, and no need to go to it unless you'd like us to, but day 221, page 145 at 22, in answer to the chairman's question, that the general approval given to what you might call these common wall types was based on, and I'm quoting, inference from underlying assessments, which are themselves drawing inferences from the underlying data. Would you agree with that general description of what this guidance note was now permitting?
Yes.
Was the board told that the purpose of this guidance note was precisely that, to enable building control officers to draw inference from underlying assessments, which are themselves inferences from underlying data?
I can't comment on the factual information that was provided to the board, but Ian Davis was involved in the discussions around the production of the guidance note and actually asked for it to be considered as a way forward. So I would assume that he would have updated the board accordingly.
Right. Do you accept that this guidance note was, in essence, a shortcut to avoid the need for compliance with option 1 or option 2 or option 3, provided that the proposed external wall build-up was going to be using the products and the dimensions listed in the appendices?
It was the equivalence of an option 3 report.
And that option 3 was an alternative to options 1 and 2, as we know.
Yes.
So I think the answer to my question is yes, so long as you used the products and the dimensions listed in the appendices, you didn't need to worry about options 1 or 2 or 3.
That's correct, but it would still be assessed on a case-by-case basis.
Yes, no, absolutely, I understand that. Was the board told that that was the purpose? In other words, it was a shortcut to avoid the need to go through option 1 or 2 or 3?
Before the guidance note was produced, it was taken to the executive directors of the main board, and they were briefed on the facade conference and the guidance and gave their approval for it to be released. So I would have assumed that by the executive directors being briefed, that they would have notified the main board.
When, and we covered this a little bit with John Lewis in his evidence, but when the decision was made by you to approve the guidance note and present it to the board, before you did that, did you think of going to an independent fire engineer, such, for example, as the BRE or Exova or Chiltern or Arup, and asking them whether this approach, this shortcut, was safe?
Well, I didn't present it to the board. It was discussed with the executive directors, which I believe Steve did. And the guidance was based on NHBC's experience of receiving option 3 reports. So it was based on the bank of data that we held, and on the basis of that and John Lewis's opinions around those reports, it was crafted along those lines.
Did you or anybody in your team look at approved document B to make sure that this approach, inference on data, was a permitted route to compliance?
It was
as a further alternative.
It was discussed with Brian Martin, and his comment was it's akin to a deemed to satisfy route.
It's not an answer to my question, I'm afraid. I'm asking you about whether you inside the NHBC picked up approved document B, opened it, looked at it, and asked yourself whether, instead of insisting that a particular wall build-up went through a full system test, and instead of a desktop, which you had assumed or thought was permitted by Appendix A, an extrapolation from a desktop from underlying data was something contemplated or permitted by ADB?
It would have been common knowledge under Regulation 7 and the guidance to Regulation 7 that past experience can be used to inform future decisions, and that had existed for quite some time in Approved Document 7.
Well, how far does that go? Here is a building built in 2007 with K15 with an ACM, 100% PE core. It's now 7 years on. It hasn't burnt down yet. Is that sufficient past experience to enable a building control officer to sign off the next one?
No. The assumption of past experience would have been on the basis of a compliant solution to start with.
Well, that's, if I may say so, with great respect, circular, because it contains in the answer the word compliance. It begs the question, with great respect, doesn't it?
No, I don't believe it does. I think when assessing projects, every project is assessed for compliance with the building regulations.
Was the board told that this approach, although not spelt out in approved document B as one of the available alternatives to compliance, was nonetheless blessed by government as akin to satisfy?
I'm sure that they would have been briefed. It wasn't me personally that did the briefing to the executive directors or then to the main board.
Did you tell the board, or did anybody, to your knowledge, tell the board that nobody in your organisation had actually examined ADB to check whether this approach was permitted?
There was no reason to examine ADB. It was common knowledge in relation to Regulation 7.
Was the board told that this approach had not been independently tested or peer-reviewed by any external fire specialist organisation such as the BRE or Oxova or Chiltern?
I don't know exactly what was reported to the board, but I would have assumed that they would have been advised that this was prepared by NHBC's specialists on the basis of the information that NHBC had received on a number of projects.
Is the reason, just revisiting the point again, that you didn't go to any of those external independent organisations and ask them whether it fitted within ADB or was otherwise safe? The fact that you simply relied on Brian Martin's presence at the conference?
No.
And the fact that he didn't object?
No, not at all. It was developed initially, as I say, to address the issue in relation to brickwork. John Lewis suggested extending the note to cover the scenarios that he had seen option 3 reports on. And on that basis, it was discussed internally. It went through peer review, authorisation through the executive directors. It was reviewed by a number of NHBC colleagues. It was then presented at a conference where other members of industry, including MHCLG officials, including Exova that had produced significant numbers of reports, and the BRE that had produced a significant number of reports, and it was made readily available for those parties to contribute or make comment, on the completed report or the completed note.
Let's look at the guidance note, please, at page, let's go back to it, NHB 6065, and let's go to Appendix 3, which relates to aluminium composite panels on page 4. And we can see the first section on the left-hand side of the column says key issues, and that sets out the importance of cavity barriers. The second paragraph states that the measure set out in the bullet points below are an ACM panel build-up that will meet BR 135 criteria. And then looking at the bullet points underneath that, the first of these appropriate measures is, quotes, the use of minimum Class B in accordance with BSEN 13501 Part 1 aluminium composite panels which provide a Class 0 surface spread of flame. And that's a relaxed requirement, isn't it, from what Technical Guidance Note 18 required, which was that all elements of the external wall build-up needed to be materials of limited combustibility.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes, that is a relaxation of option 1 in the BCA Technical Guidance Note 18, which was that all elements, including the external facings of an external wall build-up, needed to be material of limited combustibility.
This wasn't proposing an option 1. This was addressing option 3.
All right, let me put it another way. It's saying that it is appropriate to use as a rain screen panel an ACM panel of Class B. Now, you accept that that would not have met option 1?
No.
No. So it's a relaxation of that requirement, isn't it? If you were going through option 1, you couldn't use it, but if you're using this guidance, you can.
And this would be equivalent of an option 3?
well, just pausing there, just on that product, do you accept that the 2016 guidance actually contravenes Technical Guidance Note 18, so far as option 1 is concerned, doesn't it? Option 1 says you use materials of limited combustibility, and you're now saying you don't need to.
No, this relates to option 3. There are several options within the guidance, and this reflects option 3.
Were you aware at the time that Class B panels were not materials of limited combustibility?
Yes.
And then looking at below the bullet points, restrictions on use, it says the use of polythene or polythene mineral cord aluminium composite panels which do not achieve a minimum Class B combustibility classification fall outside the scope of this guidance note. Such products are unsuitable for use in high-rise situations. It is also imperative that substitution with a less fire-resistant product does not take place on site. Now, the word polythene there, I think you thought was a typo.
Yes.
Mr. Lewis told us that it wasn't.
I would accept his superior knowledge of the classifications of families of products.
Did you have a discussion with him at the time about the word polythene before this document was presented to the facade conference?
I would have seen several drafts of this based on the initial draft around brickwork facades. Then it was updated and amended as things were added. So there would have been several iterations that it may have been word blindness or other things that it wasn't picked up through the course of proofreading.
Did you have a discussion with him at any time about whether the word polythene was or wasn't a typo?
I don't recall.
Right. Well, we may come back to that in a moment. It's clear, I think, that the guidance note accepts PE cord ACM panels provided they achieve a minimum of Class B combustibility. Yes?
No.
No? No? Why no?
Certainly not the way I read it. And if you can scroll back up, the introduction to this section talks about mineral cord aluminium composite panels. So that would have been the basis for this appendix. And then the restrictions on use, and again, the way I read it and understood it was intended, was the restrictions would exclude the use of all pure polythene cord and only accept polythene mineral cord that achieved a Class B.
What content of mineral core?
I would leave that to the fire engineers, but from discussions with John Lewis, I think it's 70-30. That's the sort of standard that we have seen through option 3 reports.
When were those discussions?
Throughout the course of the option 3 escalations and reviews.
You say 70-30, so 70 mineral, 30 PE.
Yes.
And that was a standard fixed at the time, was it, in the discussions?
It was what we saw through option 3 reports that, again, not my area of expertise, but the way I understood it, there are 3 classes of ACM, one that is fully fire rated that has a pure mineral core, one that has a mixture based on the approximately 70-30, and one that has a polyethylene core.
Are they always 70-30, or might they be 80-20 or 60-40?
I don't know. It's outside my area of expertise.
The reason I'm asking you is because we've not seen any documents evidencing any discussion between you and John Lewis about the precise threshold for acceptability of mineral content. Are you sure there was that sort of discussion at the time before this guidance note was published?
Absolutely. They would have been discussed on a case-by-case basis for option 3 reports. And John Lewis would have educated myself on what those different standards of ACM related to.
So can you explain why this note does not say in either the first bullet point I've read to you or the restrictions on use that I've read to you that polythene or polyethylene mineral cord aluminium composite panels needed to have a mineral content of at least 70%? Can you explain why that is not there?
Presumably because it's probably not common in terms of the understanding around different classifications of ACM, and Class B is more commonly understood.
Why did you allow a document which simply said polythene mineral cord, stroke mineral cord aluminium composite panels, without specifying the safety threshold of the mineral content, to go out, if you knew that that was the safety threshold?
On the basis that people undertaking the submissions to NHBC would have used an expert to produce any information to us, but also on the basis that our staff checking the application when it was received on a project-specific basis would understand what Class B meant.
On the polythene I've asked you about, we've moved away from my question. There's no... It's... Let me start again. It says the use of polythene or polythene mineral cord aluminium composite panels which do not achieve a minimum Class B combustibility classification, etc. What was the purpose of referring to polythene aluminium composite panels in contradistinction to those which had a mineral core?
Sorry, could you rephrase the question?
What was the purpose of having both in there as an alternative, polythene or polythene mineral core?
It was capturing all of the restrictions around the guidance. So any polyethylene core panel and any polyethylene mineral core panel that didn't achieve a Class B would fall outside the scope of the guidance.
What was the purpose of having a reference to polythene or polythene mineral core? Why not just say ACM panels which do not achieve minimum Class B? What was the purpose of referring to the core at all?
Just to make it explicit that both classes were considered and restricted in use by that paragraph.
But it doesn't do that, does it? In fact, what it does is it tells you that you can use a 100% polyethylene core provided it achieves a minimum Class B combustibility classification, if there is such a thing.
No, I don't believe it does. The way that I've read it and it was being applied by my teams was that the use of polyethylene, full stop, and the use of polyethylene mineral core panels that didn't achieve Class B fell outside the scope of this guidance.
Well, that's what it says. But my question is slightly different. What was the point of referring to polythene as opposed to any core with a mineral content, unless you were intending to hint, at least, that the use of polythene, pure polythene, polyethylene core was acceptable, provided it achieved minimum Class B?
I don't think there was any hint that it was acceptable. It was very clear, in my mind, on the restrictions on use, that polyethylene was not included in this note.
I think what you're telling us is that you read this as if there were a comma after polythene and a comma after classification, so that the sense is the use of polythene falls outside the scope of this guidance, and the use of polythene mineral cord panels which don't achieve a Class B fall outside the scope of this guidance. Is that what you're saying?
Correct, yes.
Thank you. I mean, the commas aren't there, of course.
No.
But that's what you're saying you understood it to mean.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Why not make it clearer?
Well, that was one of the reasons that we decided to withdraw the guidance, because it could be open to being misread. I was clear in my mind, the wording and the intention, but what wasn't clear was the way other people were perceiving the guidance. Not that any of my staff read it incorrectly. All of my staff that applied it as I've stated.
Did you have a discussion
Sorry,
with John?
Can I just I'm sorry to cut across you, Mr. Lee, but the restriction on use was essentially to ensure that the panel had a minimum reaction to fire classification, wasn't it?
Correct.
And that was going to be Class B. So what was wrong with the use, if it existed, of a polythene cord panel which had achieved a Class B?
Well, one, we didn't think such a panel existed.
Well, in that case, it wouldn't apply, but...
But to be sure and to make it clear, because we had seen submissions under some building control applications where, because of the ambiguity or misunderstanding around filler, we had seen PE cord panel proposed. So this was to make it explicit that any PE cord panel should not be used.
Even if it had a certificate from the BBA, for example, saying that it was a Class B?
Again, the way that these were assessed and the way that the training was rolled out to my staff, they would look at the BBA certificate and they would read it in its entirety and question if a PE cord panel would achieve a Class B.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Mr. Millett.
You're telling builders here, and I think BCOs, that an external wall build-up of ACM panels of Class B, and therefore not material of limited combustibility, together with insulation products, and you can see them on the right-hand side of the screen if we just scroll down. You see insulation, Kingspan, Celotex, Extratherm.
Yes.
Which are not materials of limited combustibility, are they?
No.
No. So you're telling builders and BCOs that an external wall build-up with ACM Class B panels and insulation products of those kinds, neither of which and none of which are materials of limited combustibility, is acceptable for meeting the functional requirement B4. Yes?
As the equivalent to option 3, and I would just state that it was to NHBC staff and NHBC customers.
Yes, you've said that, but you're telling them that your guidance is that the use of those materials combined in a high-rise external wall build-up was acceptable for the purposes of meeting the functional requirement B4.
Yes, as the equivalent to an option 3.
And just help me, how is that consistent with the provisions of approved document B?
As I've mentioned, it's akin to a deemed to satisfy route that exists under Regulation 7.
Now, while we're in this document, you'll see that in two places, on the left-hand side, first bullet point, and on the right-hand side, it refers to Class 0 surface spread of flame, or Class 0 surface spread of flame classification. Did you realise that Class 0 is not a surface spread of flame classification, but a combination of surface spread of flame and fire propagation?
Yes.
You did. Did you intend that the use of the expression Class 0 surface spread of flame meant that ACM panels only had to pass BS 476 Part 7, which is the surface spread of flame test?
No, I think the common understanding of Class 0 surface spread of flame would cover both of those tests.
Well, what was the purpose of using the word surface spread of flame classification?
To make it clear that what we had seen through some of the option 3 reports was the use of different aluminium panels that were varied, their classification was varied by the colour of paint, for example, and the external finish. So it was about identifying that the surface spread of flame rating achieved the Class 0.
So that would tend to indicate that you would accept a panel which had not passed the BS 476 Part 6 propagation test, but had passed the surface spread of flame under Test 7, Part 7.
That certainly wasn't the intention of the wording.
No, but you can see how you can read it, can't you?
Yes.
And indeed, Mr. Lewis accepted that, and accepted that it was inaccurate and misleading. Would you agree?
No.
No. But you would agree, I think, that if you're defining Class 0, you don't define it by reference solely to surface spread of flame because it's a two-part test, isn't it?
It is, yes.
And therefore, to say a Class 0 surface spread of flame classification is, in fact, only half the story, isn't it?
I think it would have been understood by the audience that were using this guidance.
You think it would have been, but why put something in there that's at least ambiguous on the basis that you hope they might or thought they might understand it? It's a bit like the commas absent.
Yes, well, I was confident that my surveyors understood it and the intention of the wording, and they would then have the responsibility, if it was misunderstood by any of our customers, to go back and advise, challenge, or provide further evidence.
Looking at the guidance from the bottom of, if we could just scroll down first, please, to the bottom of the left-hand column, page 4, and then up to the top of page 4, right-hand column. If we could just scroll back up, please. You could see what, in fact, what is to be accepted as meeting the requirement B4 is a list of products and dimensions, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. There's nothing in there about orientation or spacing or anything like that, other than what we see here. Yes?
Correct.
Yes. And in fact, do you accept that it was entirely possible for a building control officer to pick up this document and, provided it had all these things in it, such as Kingspan K15, together with a Class B panel, both of which were materials of, both of which were not materials of limited combustibility, that person could confidently sign off a building, not only as meeting approved document B, but as meeting requirement B4 Part 1.
This was obviously targeted towards NHBC staff who understood the requirements and would assess the project on a case-by-case basis based on this baseline of data. It would still go through a detailed project review to look at the fixings, the spacings, and other aspects.
And this list isn't supported by a particular build-up which had undergone an 8414 test?
I don't think so.
No. And this list contains, as we've been over a number of times, materials of limited combustibility. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. Do you accept that it is in effect an end run around option 1 and 2?
No, as I've stated, this is the equivalent of an option 3.
Well, you say that, but isn't the effect that your understanding of paragraph 12.7, which underpins option 1, was that it required all elements of the external wall to be of limited combustibility?
Yes.
And the result of Appendix 3 is that you can have an external wall without any elements of limited combustibility, at least as far as insulation and rain screen is concerned. It's completely contradictory.
No, the rain screen would be governed by the use of a mineral core cladding based on the 70-30.
Yes, but still only a Class B.
Yes.
Not a material of limited combustibility.
And that had been justified through a number of option 3 reports and, I believe, subsequently tested.
Well, so you say, but the result is that we now have a scheme, or at least a structure described here, which is inconsistent with the fundamental principle set out in paragraph 12.7 of ADB. Is that right?
12.7, yes, but
yes,
meeting alternative options.
Well, you end up with something completely different, don't you?
Yes.
Thank you.
Did Steve Evans or John Lewis ever discuss with you the fact that they had been forwarded an email by Brian Martin in February 2016, so earlier in the year, where he expressed the view that he wasn't sure that even fire retardant ACM panels could achieve limited combustibility ratings or pass an 8414 test? Was that ever brought to your attention?
I don't recall if I saw it at the time or if I've seen it through preparing to give evidence.
Well, let's just look at it then to be clear. NHB 402864. This is the top email, February 16, which postdates the January Ciderised Facades Conference. And if you scroll down, please, to page 2, you can see that there's an email from Brian Martin to Nick Jenkins of Booth Murie. It's copied to a number of people at the BRE, where he says in the second line, I'm not entirely sure that even the ACM products that have flame retardant, in quotes, cores would meet the rules of thumb in the AD. So it'll be interesting to see if any of them get through an 8414 test. Now, did you see this email at the time? I know you're not copied in on it, but did you see it at the time, do you think?
I don't believe I did. I think I saw it as part of the preparation for today.
Right. You may not have seen the email then, but was there any discussion you were involved in or even overheard to that effect?
Not to my knowledge.
Were you aware at the time of the guidance note that no successful large-scale fire test under BS 8414, parts 1 or 2, had taken place using ACM panels as the external panels?
I don't believe so.
You don't believe you were aware? You mean you thought there had been, or you thought there hadn't been?
I didn't know.
You didn't know? Mm. If you didn't, what, you didn't know one way or the other?
Yes.
Right. If you didn't know one way or the other, why didn't you check?
I was relying on the expertise of my specialists.
You see, given the dangers of ACM and the grave danger that they presented, why not check for yourself and make sure? If you were going to put out a note that suggested that an extrapolation of data was going to be acceptable to meet the requirements of B41, that there was at least a test using ACM under 8414 where the full system had passed. Why did you not do that?
I relied on the expertise of my specialists.
Yes. Now, are you aware that after the Grenfell Tower fire, the DCLG carried out some 7 tests using ACM panels, yes?
Yes.
Indeed, they used ACM fire retardant panels with PIR and phenolic insulation and failed to meet the criteria under BR 135.
Yes.
Yes. Which would have been acceptable under your note, wouldn't they?
Yes, based on industry understanding at the time.
Mm. I'm going to put 3 things to you, and I'd just like to know what you say. First, do you accept that the principles set out in Appendix 3 of the guidance note were not just not supported by the guidance in approved document B, but were in contravention of them?
No, I don't accept that.
Do you accept that they weren't backed up by any data from large-scale test evidence applicable to wall constructions featuring these materials?
Yes, not to my knowledge.
Mm. Do you agree that, in fact, they were proved to be dangerous and flawed from the subsequent testing that took place after the fire?
Yes, once testing had been done on panels, yes.
Can we go to WIN 702, please? This is a witness statement from Stuart Taylor of Wintec, who was a member of the CWCT. And at page 45, paragraph 103, this is what he has to say about your note. I cannot recall when I first saw this document. My views were that I completely disagreed with its contents. The document generally allowed the use of materials which are not classed as limited combustibility, Class A2, in accordance with EN 13501. For example, the guidance in Appendix 3, aluminium composite panels, allowed minimum Class B ACM panels, combustible insulation in the SFS zone, minimum Class B cement particle sheathing board, and K15 or Celotex RS5000, or extratherm foam insulation in a drained and ventilated cavity. This guidance in no way resembles the guidance in ADB 2, 2007. I regarded the document as being quite irresponsible, and I do not know why such a document had been produced, especially after Wintec had spoken to the Nhbc in 2013 about the issues of using combustible materials on buildings with a story equal to or greater than 18 metres. I showed that to Mr. Lewis yesterday, I'd just like to show you what he says. It's day 225, page 59, please. And I'll pick it up at line 15. Line 15, and my question to him was, do you disagree with anything that Mr. Taylor says there? And after a pause, the answer was, the only bit I have to, or not take issue with, but, query is the bit about being quite irresponsible. We were not wanting to be irresponsible. We were, trying to do things in a better way. That implies that we were quite blasé about it. That was certainly not the case. But apart from that, I think what he says is probably true. Question, right. And then over the page, let me suggest to you that his characterisation of this note as completely irresponsible or quite irresponsible is correct, and it was a dangerous mistake on the part of NHBC designed to go back to business as usual and at the expense of life safety. What do you say to that? And then he says this, I have to agree it shouldn't have been written. If it was, no, it shouldn't have been written. We shouldn't have done it. I mean, in all of this, as I say, we did do a review afterwards as to where any buildings had relied upon this guidance note, and, in that review we found that it had not been used on any building we could identify. That is its only saving grace, for want of a better word, from my point of view, is that it never actually got used. Now, that was Mr. Lewis's evidence to the inquiry. I want to ask you about his answer at lines 7 to 16. Do you agree with it?
I think the knowledge at the time allowed us to produce the guidance note for our customers based on the evidence that we had. Obviously, subsequent test data has raised questions over Class B. However, there have been successful tests carried out on Class B panels.
Do you agree with what Mr. Lewis told the inquiry yesterday there?
Not at the time, no.
Let's go back to your statement then, please, page 42. Paragraph 198 at the foot of the page. After the Grenfell Tower fire occurred, I discussed the 2016 guidance note with the senior leadership at NHBC, which included Ian Davis, Neil Jefferson, Sarah Hamilton and Lewis Sidnick, among others. We felt the 2016 guidance note could be misinterpreted, and NHBC decided to withdraw it. This was because, A, it was only for NHBC customers, not the industry as a whole. B, we did not want it to be a distraction from the key issues relating to the Grenfell Tower fire, given that NHBC had no involvement in that tragic event. C, the point above about the spelling error was also a contributing factor. First, who was Sarah Hamilton and Lewis Sidnick?
Lewis Sidnick is our head of corporate affairs, and Sarah Hamilton was our head of communications.
I see. Oh, I see. So not technical people?
No.
Right. Now, those people, or those with whom you discussed it, so Ian Davis and Neil Jefferson, were they all on the executive board of the NHBC?
Neil and Ian were, yes.
Is there a note of the discussions which led to the decision to withdraw this guidance, or a note of the decision itself? We haven't seen one.
I think it was a phone conversation or a meeting.
Now, you say that one of the reasons you give is that it could be misinterpreted, you say. You just
Yes.
go back to the foot of page 42. You say that one of the reasons, well, you say you felt it could be misinterpreted and you decided to withdraw it.
Yes.
Yes. Which word or sentence in the guidance note had been misinterpreted?
I think as we went through earlier, the reference at the start of Appendix C that talked about mineral core and the restrictions on use.
You don't identify those particularly in your statement. Why is that?
Well, I referenced the high-level issues with being misinterpreted, and those were the points that were relevant.
What was the spelling error?
It was the polythene debate.
Well, you see, before making that a basis of a decision to withdraw the note, did you go back to John Lewis and ask him whether in fact it was a mistake or whether he intended to put polythene?
No, because that was one factor in the decision to withdraw.
Well, of three?
It wasn't the only factor.
Of three?
Yes.
Yes. Given that it was one of three factors, did you not, or why did you not, go back to John Lewis and ask him whether it was actually a mistake or whether he intended it?
Because it wouldn't have changed the overall decision.
Maybe not, but if you're going to withdraw a document based on a typo, surely the sensible thing to do would be to go to the draftsman and ask them whether it really was a typo or whether it was intentional. No?
That was... It was not relevant because the decision had been taken on the basis of the other 2 points. So the fact that we had agreed to withdraw that guidance note, whether or not that typo was correct or not, wouldn't have made a difference to the decision.
Well, that's not right, is it? Because you say, if you go over the page, please, the top of page 43, that the point about the spelling error was a contributing factor. Was it a contributing factor or was it not a contributing factor?
It was considered.
But was it a contributing factor to the decision, Miss Marshall?
It was considered alongside the other points that I've raised as one element that raised questions over the guidance note.
And before allowing it to be an element in that decision, why did you not go to John Lewis and ask him, is this what you meant to write, polythene, or did you mean to write polyethylene?
Because at the end of the day, the other 2 factors were indicating that we were going to withdraw the guidance anyway.
If you had had faith in the approach taken in this document but thought it had been misunderstood or misinterpreted, why didn't you simply publish a correction, an amendment to it, stating the proper interpretation rather than in withdrawing it wholesale?
I think given the fact that I think the guidance note had been in place for a year and it had been used in a limited fashion, there was no reason to update it, and we were seeing more and more movement to options 1 and 2, and the guidance note had limited value.
Is the truth, in fact, that you realised at this point after the fire, if not before, that this document was an instruction to your customers and your building control officers on how to get around ADB, and not a guide about how to ensure that each separate building envelope could meet the functional requirement?
No.
Now, you say that this note was a distraction. Do you mean that it wasn't relevant to the Grenfell Tower fire at all?
It shouldn't have been relevant to the Grenfell fire because this was targeted to NHBC customers and used by NHBC staff.
Yes, as you say. So do you mean that for that reason it had no relevance at all to the Grenfell Tower fire?
It was... Sorry, could you rephrase the question?
Well, you say it was a distraction. Do you mean by that it wasn't relevant to the Grenfell Tower fire?
The distraction was around interest in our guidance and the misunderstanding of the guidance, and it wasn't relevant to anyone that wasn't an NHBC customer and using our services.
I mean, given that the wall build-up at Grenfell Tower featured RS5000, which is in your list, K15, which was in your list, and PE Cord ACM panels as the rain screen, which was even making allowance for the misunderstanding of the comma point in your list, can you explain how you and your board could possibly have considered that the guidance note, which blessed the use of exactly those components over 18 metres, could have been anything other than of the most central relevance to why Grenfell Tower performed as it did on the night of the 14th of June 2017?
I don't believe that the guidance note sanctioned the use of PE cord panels.
So you say, but you can well understand, can't you, and I put it to you that you would have done at the time, that some people reading that might have done. And might well have done until the chairman identified that the sentence in the restrictions fell into 2 parts divided by the invisible commas.
That was always the intention of the wording. That was my understanding of the wording, and it was the understanding of my staff that were applying that guide of the wording. It was targeted to NHBC staff and NHBC customers. I wouldn't expect other building control bodies to accept on face value anything that NHBC publishes without carrying out due diligence and assessing the project on a case-by-case basis.
Now let's look at some exchanges that you had with government after the fire. Can we please go first to NHB 401460? This is an email of the 16th of June. And I need to go, please, to page 2 in this email run, which is an email from Brian Martin to you, and you alone, forwarding something, rebuttal of Times article. Apologies in advance for asking, but I've been asked to prepare a rebuttal of the assertion that PE cord ACM panels comply with the guidance in ADB. I've also been asked if an independent expert would be willing to say this or something similar in public. Can you consider the attached and let me know, please? Brian. And were you surprised to receive this approach from Brian Martin?
No, I think Brian, I had a professional relationship with Brian where we would ask each other questions.
Do you know of any reason why he chose to approach you for assistance in particular?
No.
Do you know of any reason why Brian Martin believed that you would be able to support him in his endeavour?
I think because of the assertion about PE cord panels, Brian was aware of the view of NHBC around the definition of filler, etc.
Yes. Did you consider it appropriate that a government official was approaching you with a pre-prepared script, or proposed pre-prepared script, in support of government after the Grenfell Tower fire?
It was unusual.
Yes, but was it appropriate? Did you think it was appropriate?
I don't know if I considered it at the time.
Let's look at the attachment, please, which is a separate document, NHB 401458. In the Times, and I'll read it to you. The Times asserts that cladding on the Grenfell Tower was formed using a composite aluminium with a polyethylene core. It claims that such panels conform to UK standards but are prohibited in other countries. We cannot comment on what has or has not been used on Grenfell Tower, but we would dispute the assertion that a polyethylene cored panel is acceptable for use under current building regulations. Requirement B4 of the Building Regulations 2010 provides that the external walls of the building shall adequately resist the spread of fire over the walls and from one building to another, para 12.5. The guidance in approved document B that supports this requirement says that the external envelope of a building should not provide a medium for fire spread. It goes on to provide detailed advice that in a building with a story over 18 metres or more above ground level, any insulation product, filler material, not including gaskets, sealants and similar, etc., used in the external wall construction should be of limited combustibility, paragraph 12.7. Unmodified polyethylene would not meet the definition of limited combustibility, so a composite panel formed with a polyester core could not be considered to comply with this guidance. As such, it should not be used as a cladding material on buildings over 18 metres in height. And your response, we see, is on page 1 of the email run. And let's go back to that, if we can, please. NHB, yes, thank you. And you say, "Hi, Brian, thanks for the email. Whilst I fully agree with the content of your suggested text, I believe that it may be seen to be more independent by engaging with the BCA as the broader body representing all BCBs. The current chairman is Martin Conlon, who I know has already been involved in some media coverage, so I'd imagine would be happy to support you. His email address is, and it's been redacted, regards Diane Marshall." Why did you think that for you to assist Brian Martin with his rebuttal might not be or appear to be sufficiently independent?
It would only be the view of one building control body, and if Brian was looking for support or an independent view, it would be it would be more representative of the industry if BCA were able to
I
support
see.
that.
I follow. So by the word independent, you don't mean actually independent, you mean representative.
Yes.
Were you concerned about supporting the government's position after the fire at Grenfell Tower?
No.
Did you think that it was consistent with the government's historic position on PE cord aluminium composite material panels above 18 metres?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah. Did you think that the approach set out in the proposed text I've read to you was consistent with the government's historic position on PE cord ACM panels over 18 metres?
The definition of filler, etc., was open to interpretation, and we saw that through our role as a warranty body, where there were different approaches to filler, etc.
So your full agreement was, to cut a long story short, the historic background to option 1 and the text of option 1. I'm using shorthand here, but
Yes.
full material MALC.
Yes.
Right. And in your mind, that was driven by the word filler in 12.7, I think, as
Yes.
you told us yesterday. Did you agree that cladding panels were indeed required to be of limited combustibility? I think the answer is yes, isn't it?
Subject to option 3.
Well, there's no discussion about that in this document, is there? In the draft.
I think the draft mentioned PE core, not any other panel.
So how did your agreement with Brian Martin's suggested text conform with NHBC's 2016 guidance note, which allowed external cladding panels with a Class B classification?
Because they excluded polyethylene cord panels by the restrictions of use.
Right. You say that, but was in fact not the real problem here that you couldn't be seen to be disputing the assertion that a polythene cord panel was acceptable for use under current building regulations, precisely because your 2016 guidance note said, at least on one reading, but I would put to you clearly, that you accepted PE cord ACM panels so long as they achieved Class B?
No, I disagree.
You disagree. And just tell me again why you disagree.
Because our guidance note excluded the use of polyethylene cord panels.
Now, Brian Martin refers to unmodified polyethylene, but even a polyethylene cord modified with mineral filler would not be a material of limited combustibility, would it?
No.
No. So even on your guidance note, which, let it be assumed, allowed a 70-30 mineral core, so long as it was Class B, still wouldn't comply, would it?
With option 1, no.
Which is the point that Brian Martin is making in his text, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. And did you agree, or do you agree now, that what Mr. Martin is stating in his rebuttal to the Times is actually in contravention of, or at least diametrically opposite to, the practices at NHBC, where ACM panels, let it be assumed, of a 70-30 mineral core were being accepted so long as they were Class B?
On the basis of an option 3 report, yes.
Did you not think to go back to him and say, well, actually, we've got a slightly different position here because of our 2016 guidance note, which you, Brian, knew all about because you were at the conference?
No, I think because Brian had seen the guidance note and it was clear in my mind, and you'll have to ask Brian Martin what his view was, but it was clear that we were excluding polyethylene cord panels.
Did you have a conversation with Brian Martin about your 2016 guidance note after the fire?
I believe that the conversation with Brian about the guidance note was prior to the conference, that Steve Evans had those discussions.
Certainly, and we have emails on that, and we looked at those with Mr. Evans when he gave evidence before Christmas. But
Yes.
I'm asking you about the fire. Did you or Steve Evans or anybody else at NHBC have a discussion with Brian Martin about your 2016 guidance note after the fire?
think that we advised him that it had been withdrawn.
Now, let's go to another document, NHB 401465, please. And if we look at the first email in the chain at the foot of page 2 and over to page 3, this is an email of the 26th of June 2017 from Brian Martin to you. NHBC note, acceptability of common wall constructions, importance high. Hi, Diane. The attached document has come up in response to the Grenfell Tower incident. It mentions the use of Euro Class B ACM panels for cladding high-rise buildings. I'm assuming that this was based on test reports and/or assessments of systems using Class B panels. This would imply that some of the buildings that have been found with Class B panels may be okay without any remedial action. Can you check if NHBC has seen any BS 8414 test results for Class B panels, please? I appreciate there might be confidentiality issues here, but any information you can share would be appreciated. Best regards, Brian. Now, the document he attached, take this from me, was the 2016 guidance note. Did you ask him what he was referring to when he said that that guidance note had come up in response to the Grenfell Tower incident, as he says?
Sorry, could you scroll up to show the date of this email?
Yes, it's the 26th of June. You can go to the bottom of page 2. 26th of June.
I believe by this stage we would have been aware of some media attention around the guidance note.
Right. I see. So your understanding was that when he says come up in response to the Grenfell Tower incident, that was a reference to a media discussion, was it?
That was my understanding, yes.
And where did that understanding come from?
Well, having seen, I think there was something on Newsnight.
Were you concerned when you saw his question or his assumption that the use of Class B ACM panels on high-rises was based on test reports or assessment using Class B panels? Were you concerned by that?
Sorry, could you scroll down, please?
Yes, of course. I'm so sorry. You're right. Page 3. Third line.
No, he would have been correct in that the acceptance of Class B was based on assessments of Class B systems.
Were you concerned by the question or his request that you should check whether you'd seen any 8414 test results for Class B panels?
Not concerned. I just saw it as an inquiry.
Right. Class B panels, did you read that as Class B panels which were or Class B panels which were not ACM?
I read it as any Class B panel.
Why? After all, in the second line in front of you there, he's referring to Class B ACM panels. That's the subject.
It is, and I think when I responded to him, I gave him a summary of any relevant Class B assessment that we'd seen.
Were you not concerned that he was asking you about whether there were any tests or assessments of Class B ACM panels and asking you if you'd seen any test results, given that you hadn't, in fact, seen any test results for Class B ACM panels?
I think I'd taken the third line as assessments of systems using Class B panels on the broader sense of Class B, not limiting it to ACM.
Why?
That's the way that I read it.
It's very convenient reading, isn't it? To ignore the fact that he's talking about ACM panels and to think that he might be asking you about homogeneous panels, such as cementitious particle boards.
No, I went back with a comprehensive response on all of the information we had in relation to Class B.
Now, you went back to him, in fact, as we see in the next email, bottom of page 1, on the 29th of June. As you can see there, and it goes over the page. I don't think I need to dip into that quite yet. Before I do, Did you tell the directors of NHBC that you'd been asked these questions by government?
I would have told Ian Davis.
Right. Now, here we see Brian Martin's interest in the guidance note. Presumably at this stage, you didn't think it was a distraction because here was government asking you about it.
Now, I can't recall the timeline of when we agreed to withdraw. I think we notified Brian after this date, but I think that's correct.
Now, going to page 1 and looking at your response we've got here, it's dated the 29th of June, 3 days later. Did you write this email yourself, or did you have some help?
I think that either John Lewis or Steve Evans would have drafted it for me.
Right. Does that tell us that you weren't confident about or familiar enough with the 2016 guidance to prepare the response yourself?
No, it was reliant on John Lewis, who had seen all of the option 3 reports and assessed them to give a summary of any that had a relevant reference to a Class B rating.
Right. Now, let's look at the response. Dear Brian, you'll recall that we launched the NHBC guidance note, acceptability of common wall constructions containing combustible materials in high-rise buildings, at our facades conference in July last year, where you very kindly presented on the regulatory requirements relating to facades. Just pausing there, was that an attempt to suggest to Brian Martin that he, because he was in attendance when the guidance note was launched, was well aware of it and had not objected to it at the time?
That was a statement of fact.
Indeed. What was its relevance, though, to his as a response to his question?
Could you scroll down to his question, please?
Well, yes.
Thank you.
Of course, page 3. Of course we can do that. Questions are... Well, you can see the questions. We've been through this now, and you can see what I've asked you about it, but take your time over it.
I think it was to put things into context in relation to the attached document, because to remind him that he had seen it previously.
And what was the purpose of doing that? I ask the question again. Was the purpose of doing so to remind him that he was in attendance when the guidance note was launched, knew all about it, and had not objected to it at the time?
It was context within the response.
Your response continues, if we can go back to page 1, please. The guidance document was produced to provide pragmatic, deemed to satisfy advice to builders on a limited number of the most common wall and facade types encountered on tall buildings, where NHBC had already received a number of assessments under BCA Guidance Note 18. The advice is based on 3 types of common cladding incorporated into a robust construction, which has been the subject of a number of BS 8414 Part 2 tests. So far, all you're doing is essentially summarising what the guidance note says, aren't you?
Yes.
Yeah. What was the point of doing that? Was that just context again?
Yes.
Continuing, the NHBC guidance note accepts the use of ACM panels which achieve a Class B fire rating. And just pausing there, you don't say it doesn't accept the use of ACM 100% PE core, do you? The focus there is Class B, yes?
Yes.
Yeah.
The PE core was by the restrictions on use within the guidance.
There are no published 8414 tests of wall makeups containing aluminium mineral core panels. Our acceptance was based on 34 option, I think it should be 134 in fact, doesn't matter. Option 3 assessments that we received from builders justifying the use of Class B panels in line with the guidance in BCA Guidance Note 18. And you go on to say the assessments were received from suitably qualified fire engineers such as Exover, BB7, BWC and HH Fire Limited. And you go on to explain the basis of the tests, or rather the basis of the option 3 reports. You see that? I'm summarising
Yes.
in the interests of time. And then you say halfway down the paragraph, using the results of these tests, the fire engineers were able to demonstrate that the use of different Class B panels and different types of insulation products would be expected to behave in a similar way, and certainly no worse than the tested wall makeups. 7 of these assessments incorporated ACM panels, all of which use Class B fire-rated versions of the panels. These fire ratings were verified by the submission of an appropriate third-party certification, such as a manufacturer's published test data or BBA. Nhbc has not accepted any justifications for a 100% polyethylene cord panel and was not aware at the time of any 100% polyethylene cord ACM products which achieve a Class B rating. Nhbc would have requested further evidence, in addition to a BBA certificate, for any such submission. We've withdrawn the guidance note from our website. The option would still, however, be opened for a builder to demonstrate compliance by submitting an assessment based on the guidance in the BCA Note 18. Please let me know if you need anything further. Now, first, why do you tell him that the advice was based on 3 types of common cladding incorporated into a robust construction, which have been the subject of a number of 8414 Part 2 tests? Which Part 2 tests were you referring to?
I don't know. It would have been John Lewis that would have put this together based on his knowledge.
Right. You say the NHBC guidance note accepts the use of ACM panels which achieve a Class B fire rating. That demonstrates, doesn't it, that you're not, in fact, endorsing Mr. Martin's suggested text in his 16th of June email that we looked at as a riposte to the Times, because Class B is not a material of limited combustibility.
The content of that text was around polyethylene cord panels.
And when you go on to say that there are no published 8414 tests of wall makeups containing aluminium mineral cord panels, you see that?
Yes.
Our acceptance was based on 34. It's over the page, actually. It's at the back. If one goes back up to the bottom of page 1, you can see there are no published 8414 tests of wall makeups containing aluminium mineral cord panels. Our acceptance was based on 34 option 3 assessments received from builders justifying the use of Class B panels in line with the Guidance Note 18. Now, just pausing there, the results that use Kingspan and Class B panels, what panels were used in the assessments that you're referring to?
I couldn't tell you. That would be one for John Lewis to...
Did you not ask those people what this meant or what you were referring to?
No, on the basis that John Lewis was involved in all of the reviews of the Option 3 reports and would be familiar with what evidence he'd seen, I asked him to compile this so that I could respond back to Brian.
Right. Did you know that there were 3 such tests, Korea, Stofix and Gebrick panels? Was that familiar to you? No? You're looking...
I think I've heard...
Right.
them referenced in reports, but I wouldn't have been able to tell you the name if you hadn't mentioned.
Did anybody tell you that none of those was a Class B ACM panel?
I think that's within the body of the email.
So you knew that. And as I've read to you, it says NHBC had not accepted any justifications for a 100% polyethylene cord panel and was not aware at any time of any 100% polyethylene. We need to go back, I'm so sorry, to page 2. That last, the pre-penultimate paragraph. I've read that to you already. Just look at that. Mm-hmm. That's not consistent with what you told us this morning about how to read the restriction in the guidance, is it? Because you don't say there, NHBC never accepts 100% polyethylene cord panel and our 2016 guidance bans it. You don't say that, do you?
No, I don't, but it's implied.
Well, it's not implied. On the contrary, in fact, you go on to say NHBC would have requested further evidence in addition to a BBA certificate for any such submission. What you're telling him isn't that it's banned. What you're telling him is that you don't know of any which achieve a Class B, but would want to see proof. Now that, I have to have to put to you is exactly the right way of reading the restrictions on use in the guidance. And that what you told the chairman in agreeing with his parenthesis with the commas is in fact not how you saw it at the time.
No, I disagree.
Right. Mr. Chairman, can I just finish off on this email?
Yes, of course.
I think you've done no research yourself to undertake, to satisfy yourself that the ACM panels achieved an acceptable mineral polyethylene mix.
No, I relied on my specialist.
Right. And the email finishes, as we've seen, with the paragraph, the option would still, however, be open for a builder to demonstrate compliance, etc. Were you concerned that at no time did NHBC ever have sight of any test reports for Class B ACM panels?
On the basis of the option 3 submissions and the range of fire engineers that were submitting those and the opinion of our specialist, I was happy to accept those.
Was it the realisation that that NHB had actually never seen any test reports for producing data justifying the use of Class B ACM panels the reason that you withdrew this guidance?
No.
Was the reason you withdrew this guidance the fact that Brian Martin had asked you that very question and you couldn't really answer it?
No.
Did you hear further from Brian Martin or anybody else at the department in respect of NHBC's 2016 guidance after this exchange?
I can't recall.
Mr. Chairman, I'm grateful to you and to the witness for allowing me to continue. I am likely to have finished, but I do need to check my notes.
Yes. Now, if you had finished, I would now be explaining to the witness that we need to have a break so that other people may have a chance to submit questions.
Yes.
Would it be sensible for me to indicate now that it would be helpful to have any further questions proposed over the lunch break?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, it would. I'd be grateful for that. So I would invite you to say that those who are watching this and have their own questions to submit to us should consider them and put them in before, say, 2 o'clock. It gives them a bit longer than they would normally have, even though they were eating at the same time.
Yes. As far as you can see at the moment, you have reached the end of your question.
I am likely to have done, so it involves me as well.
Well, I think for the benefit of all those who'd like to eat some lunch, which I'm sure includes Ms. Marshall and everyone else in the room, and also given the fact that those who are going to be proposing further questions will also want to have their lunch, I'm going to indicate, as I do now, that any further questions that any parties wish to propose to be put to Ms. Marshall should please be submitted to you, Mr. Millett, by 2 o'clock, but we'll take the full 1 hour for lunch so that they also get the chance to have some lunch. So we'll resume at 2:10 instead of 2 o'clock.
Yes, very good. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, there we are. We're going to break now for some lunch, Ms. Marshall. We'll come back at 2 o'clock when we may find, 2:10, I'm sorry, when we may find there are some more questions, or there may not. I don't know.
Okay.
All right. And please don't talk to anyone about your evidence over the break. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, Mr. Millett. Thank you very much. 2:10, please.